If you've come out of a dark night of the soul and you've noticed that motivation hasn't returned, this video is for you. Not the kind of I need a break tiredness, not burnout that sleep can fix, but the feeling that the force you used to rely on just isn't there anymore. Many people experience this and assume something went wrong, that they lost their drive, that they're stuck, that they fail to come back properly. What actually happens when the dark night of the soul ends, but motivation doesn't return? What was dismantled and what begins to take its place? There's a reason this happens, a reason motivation disappears after the dark night of the soul, and a reason it doesn't come back in the way people expect. There's a very specific experience that tends to show up after a dark night of the soul. It's not the collapse itself. It's not the grief or the confusion or the sense that everything fell apart. It's what comes after. You notice that motivation is gone. Not just a little lower than usual, not just needing rest, but genuinely gone. The things that used to move you no longer do. You used to be driven. You used to know how to push yourself. You used to have goals, desires, ambitions, and a kind of inner drive that could make things happen. And now that drive just isn't there. You sit down to do the things you should want to do, and nothing moves. You try to summon motivation the way you used to, and it doesn't respond. And that's profoundly unsettling. Because when motivation disappears, most people immediately assume something is wrong. They think, I've lost my edge, I've become lazy, I'm stuck, I've regressed, something broke in me. Especially if you've been someone who could function through effort, someone who was really good at functioning through effort. Especially if you were competent, capable, high functioning. The loss of motivation doesn't just feel inconvenient, it feels like a threat to who you thought you were. So you try the obvious thing. You try to go back. You go back to your old goals, your old sense of purpose, your old ideas of achievement. You tell yourself that you just need more discipline, more structure, more willpower. You try to force yourself into motion, and either nothing happens or you burn out almost immediately. You might get a brief surge of activity, just enough to exhaust you, and then everything shuts down again because force has stopped working. And that's the part that's the hardest to accept. Force used to work. Motivation used to work. It used to be enough to decide, to push, to override resistance, to impose a direction on reality and move forward. But motivation belongs to an old identity. It's a form of movement that depends on effort, pressure, and control. A way of getting life to cooperate by pushing against it. And something in you can no longer do that. Not because you're incapable, not because you failed, not because you didn't heal enough, but because the system itself has changed. Trying to function as your old self now either produces nothing or it produces exhaustion. There's no middle ground anymore. And this is where a lot of unnecessary shame sets in. People start judging themselves for something that is not a moral issue. They tell themselves they should want things again. They should be motivated again. They should be able to push through. But what's actually happening is much simpler and much more precise. What used to move you no longer works. The internal mechanism that relied on force has been dismantled. And you can feel that it's gone, even if you don't yet understand why. So for now, we're not going to fix it. We're not going to replace it. We're not going to explain it away. We're just going to name it. Motivation has stopped working. Force has stopped working. And that is not a personal failure, it's a signal. And once you stop judging the signal, you can start to understand what it's actually pointing to. So, if motivation has stopped working and force no longer moves anything, the next question naturally arises. What actually happened? Most people hear the phrase dark night of the soul and imagine something dramatic, a breakdown, a depression, a spiritual crisis, a period of suffering that needs to be survived and then overcome. But that's not quite it. The dark night of the soul is not a punishment. Yes, it's painful, but it's not a mistake. And it's not something that went wrong. It's a very precise undoing. During the dark night of the soul, everything that belongs to an old identity begins to collapse. Not randomly, not cruelly, not without a purpose, but systematically. Anything that required you to live against yourself, anything that depended on force, anything that asked you to override your own soul in order to function, that's what starts to fall apart. Structures, motivations, purposes, desires that were never truly yours. Even meanings that once felt sacred but were held in the mind rather than lived in the body. The dark night of the soul dismantles everything that contradicts life itself. Every overstructure imposed from the outside, every way you learn to act like someone instead of simply being alive. And this is why it feels so disorienting. Because what collapses is not just circumstance, your job, your preferences, your motivation. What collapses is orientation. The way you used to move through the world, the way you used to decide, the way you used to push yourself forward. That's what disappears. The purpose of the dark night of the soul is not to destroy you. It's to awaken you to life again. Not as an idea, not as a philosophy, but as something real, something tangible, something felt. And this is exactly where many people misunderstand what's happening. They assume that because things fell apart, something needs to be rebuilt quickly. A new purpose, a new goal, a new identity, a new reason to get up in the morning. But the dark night of the soul is not asking you to quickly replace your old life with a new one. Instead, it's asking for space. Space for life to reorganize itself without being forced into old shapes. This is why force has stopped working. Because force belongs to the old operating system, and motivation belonged to an identity that survived by effort, control, and pressure. And once that identity dissolves, those tools dissolve with it. Writing from the chaos of the early 20th century, the extraordinary French philosopher and mystic Simone Weil once said, "Force is as pitiless to those who possess it or think they do as it is to its victims." This is not punishment. This is not failure. This is law. This is what Simone Weil called the creation. Not destruction, but the undoing of the old self, so reality can finally enter. The system has learned something essential. It can no longer survive by cursing life. So it refuses, not as rebellion, not as laziness, but as intelligence. What feels like collapse is actually discernment. Life is withdrawing energy from what no longer allows it to move. That's why trying to go back doesn't work. That's why trying to force your old life back into shape is ineffective. Going back to your old sense of purpose won't cut it anymore. Going back to achievement won't bring energy back online. Going back to force will only exhaust you because the dark night of the soul didn't take something away by accident. It removed what was never meant to be. And until that's fully seen and metabolized, nothing new can arrive. So again, nothing is wrong. Motivation didn't disappear because you failed. It disappeared because it belonged to a way of living that contradicted life. The dark night of the soul is not the end of life. It's the end of living against it. Once life is no longer resisted, something else becomes possible. So, if motivation no longer works and force has been dismantled, the natural question becomes, what replaces it? And this is where many people get anxious. They assume something must replace motivation, that a new drive, a new purpose, a new push has to come online quickly. But motivation does not come back, at least not in the way it existed before. What replaces motivation is not another form of force. What replaces motivation after a dark night of the soul is contact with life. Because the truth is, after a spiritual awakening, life no longer responds to pressure. It responds to presence, to sensation, to movement, to immediacy. This is why trying to resurrect your old sense of purpose doesn't work anymore. You can remember what you used to care about. You can intellectually agree with it. You can even feel nostalgia for the person you used to be. But energy doesn't follow it because that version of purpose belonged to an identity that no longer exists. And life will not move through something that is no longer alive. So instead of motivation, what begins to return slowly, quietly, is vitality. Not ambition, not drive, but vitality, aliveness, life force. That feeling of being here, in your body, in time, in contact. At first, it's very subtle. It might show up as a desire to walk, to stretch, to breathe more deeply, to be in the sunlight, to listen to music, to touch something real, to start drawing again, like you used to do when you were a child. These impulses don't look impressive. They don't look like purpose. They don't look like progress. They won't get you praise from the outside world, but they're life finding its way back into motion. This is a new form of momentum, not the kind that pushes you forward, but the kind that draws you into what's already happening. After the dark night of the soul, movement comes before meaning. You don't move because you know where you're going. You move because something in you wants to move. As you allow that, without forcing it into a plan, clarity begins to return on its own. Not as a mission, not as a grand vision, not right away at least, but as orientation. You start to feel where life flows and where it doesn't, what has energy and what doesn't, what drains you and what quietly nourishes you. This is a very different way of living. You're no longer asking, what should I do with my life? You're asking, where is life moving right now? And that question is answerable, not in the mind, but in the body. This is why the dark night of the soul had to end motivation. Because egoic will alone was never meant to lead forever. It was a bridge. And once you've crossed it, life takes over. So if you're waiting for motivation to return before you live again, you'll keep waiting. But if you allow contact with breath, with movement, with the ordinary texture of being alive, momentum returns naturally. Not all at once, not dramatically, but reliably. You don't need to be pushed into life anymore. Life comes towards you. And when you let it, something very quiet but very important happens. You realize you don't need to justify being alive. You don't need a reason to move. You don't need a purpose to feel. Life itself becomes enough. If something in this exploration resonated with you, if these words met you where you are, if you recognize yourself in this movement back to life, you're welcome to subscribe. Here, I explore what happens after your old life falls apart and you begin to feel the pull again towards aliveness, vitality, and life force. Not as performance, but as truth. This work is honest, unfiltered, real. It names what usually stays unsaid. If you want to continue this inquiry, subscribe.